Were the Nazis really socialists? Well, it depends on how you define socialism. This is an article that was published in Fee by Michael Rieger. It's actually a couple of years old, but it popped up again in the feed, so apparently someone found it to be timely and interesting. And I really have a huge problem with this article because um, it comes across kind of flippant, and I don't think that was really his intent. I suspect he's functioning off of terminology he learned in college from professors who uh, have a vested interest in not defining National Socialism as socialism. And so what I've done is I'm not going to pick this entire piece apart. What I want to do is look at a couple of key items he brought up in his article where I think he's misunderstanding things. Uh, okay, so quoting the author. Once in power, the Nazis supported and were supported by big business, and they even privatized a few government operated services, all things that would make Karl Marx roll in his grave. Uh, Major problem with this is uh, to quote our Nazi friends, an example of the big lie. This is a characterization socialists, especially Marxian socialists, want to levy against the German wartime economy because their ultimate goal is to divorce this particular form of socialism from all the others because this is the one that makes all socialism look bad. Or to be more accurate, this is the form of socialism that makes all socialism look exactly like what it really is. Okay, so I'm going to be borrowing heavily from TIK History, a gentleman who is done incredible amounts of scholarly work on this, and I deeply appreciate all the mining he's done to do this. Okay, so quoting from, and I'll bring up sources as I get to them. Both governments, Nazi and Soviet, reorganized industry into larger units to increase state control over economic activity, which is socialism. The Nazis reorganized industry into 13 administrative groups with a large number of subgroups to create a private hierarchy for state control. The state could direct the firm's activities without acquiring direct ownership of the enterprises. The pre existing tendency to form cartels was encouraged to eliminate competition, which would destabilize prices. Okay. And this comes from Soviet and Nazi economic planning in the 1930s. But yes, it is why we see Nazi officials walking into the factories, taking them over from within, dictating policies to the owners as described in Gunter Riemann's The Vampire Economy and Tooze's The Wages of Destruction, to name a few. And the nationalization of industries like Junker's factory, but also those selling of those industries. Selling those industries back to individuals in the Nazi Party who can then run the businesses, sell products, and make a profit. That profit, as point 14 of the Nazi 25 points declared in 1920, shall be shared out among the community. This is why the Germans could own property and the Jews see their property taken from them, even though the National Socialists abolished private property in 1933, not long after taking power. So essentially, the claim here is by the author that the Nazis supported big business and were supported by big business. Essentially, the big business had to support the Nazi government or they would cease to exist. You would lose control of your assets if you didn't toe the Nazi line. So the idea of this being this system of mutual collaboration that's inferred from what he said is nonsensical on the surface. Uh, the Nazis essentially own the factories in all but name. Uh, at best, they're showing some uh, managerial expertise by delegating the process down to people who actually know how to run their factories, which is an area that the communists failed horribly at because they killed or drove out all the people who were actually the managerial class capable of running things. This is something the German Nazis had spotted as a flaw in the transition of the communist system. So this is a deliberate feature, but it's not meant to be the end goal. It's not meant to be how it looks in the end. They believed this cartel system needed to be in place until places like Ukraine and the Caucasus were in their control, which would allow a final full socialistic system to be put online. Okay, quoting from the author again. While the Nazis were disdainful of capitalism, this disdain did not extend to capitalists themselves. Class conflict figured little into the Nazi conception of socialism, with the exception of the party's Strasserist faction, which was purged during the Night of the Long Knives. Instead, Nazis considered both capitalists and workers necessary, occupying their own important roles within the Volksgemeinschaft. The Nazis also distinguished themselves from Marxists in their support for private property, although this came with some caveats. Okay, I'm saying that private property under National Socialism came with some caveats. Uh, Maybe the biggest understatement I've ever heard in terms of saying that private property. It's more like it's literally the inversion. Uh, the caveats, the few caveats where when private property could be exercised as if it were private property because of the massive amounts of control that were used. And again, if we read the National Socialists and what they were trying to do, they believed there had to be transitionary systems between where they were at and full socialism. This was also part of the reason, okay, to understand, whereas the Russian Marxists, Leninists, uh, took over in more or less one fell swoop, they had the ability to sweep everybody in front of them out of their way. Whereas the Nazis were elected and had to slowly take over elements of government before they could implement things, they could not do the fell swoop movement that the Russians did when they took over their government. So classifying as basically seeing the results of the 30s and 40s saying, well, they were okay with capitalists and property was fine. That's not true. The end goal was a system that had no property or free market mechanisms in place in the end. Quoting again from some of the material TIK History gives us, TIK History. Quote, the Nazis viewed private property as conditional on its use, not as a fundamental right. If the property was not being used to further Nazi goals, it could be nationalized. Professor Junkers of the Junkers Aeroplane Factory refused to follow the government's bidding in 1934. The Nazis thereupon took over the plant, compensating Junkers for his loss. This was the context on which other contracts were negotiated. Manufacturers in Germany were panic-stricken when they heard of the experiences of some of the industrialists who were more or less expropriated. Another word for saying had their property seized by the state. These industrialists were visited by state auditors who had strict orders to examine the balance sheets of all the bookkeeping entries of the company for the preceding 2, 3, or more years until some error or false entry was found. The slightest formal mistake was punished with tremendous penalties. A fine of millions of marks was imposed for a single bookkeeping error. Obviously, the examination of books was simply a pretext for partial expropriation of the private capitalist, with a view to complete expropriation and seizure of the desired property later. The owner of the property was helpless, since under National Socialism, there is no longer an independent judiciary that protects his property rights or those of other private citizens against the state. The authoritarian state has made it a principle that private property is no longer sacred. TIK is quoting Soviet and Nazi economic planning in the 1930s. Okay, so here's where I believe the author makes, okay, and it may be a misstatement. He may not have meant to say what he was saying here, because he kind of clarifies it later on, but his clarification is actually falls into the trap what I was talking about earlier. So, quoting the author, unlike Marxist democratic socialists don't believe in total government ownership of the means of production, nor do they wish to technocratically manage the economy as the Nazis did. Instead, according to the Democratic Socialists of America, they believe the workers and consumers who are affected by the economic institutions should be allowed to own and control them. Well, that's fine and dandy. So, the Democratic Socialists, if we are to believe the previous statement, Democratic Socialists believe in a form of restricted private property. So did the National Socialists. They believed in a restricted form of private property. Yet the Democratic Socialists get to call themselves socialists, and they get to remain socialists by the power of this author, yet the National Socialists don't. Why does one get the benefit of the doubt and the other does not? Why is one fitting the definition of socialism and the other not, when they're essentially both doing the same thing, just in slightly different methodologies? And the Democratic Socialists and National Socialists have a different implementation system. Clearly, the author wouldn't suggest ever that Marxist socialists were not socialists. The primary means of Marxism getting to the point where it wanted to was by class struggle, where the classes would essentially fight until there was only one class. The primary difference between Marxist socialism and National Socialism was the National Socialists replaced class struggle with race struggle. So the methodology, the tipping point, the struggle point, the critical point where the two systems believe they take over isn't enough to take them out of the running in terms of calling them a socialist. And in this case, he's willing to allow democratic socialists to call themselves socialists when they don't believe that all private property needs to be restricted. Okay. So, kind of a weird double standard there. Okay, quoting the author again, Marx hated the free market for obscuring the values of workers' labor, while Hitler hated the free market because it brought cultures closer together and made warmongering difficult. I don't know if he's just trying to make an incredibly Uh, Shallow shorthand here to describe what's going on, but to describe National Socialism as uh, the primary problem that National Socialism had with the free market system is it brought cultures close together. Is I would love to see the source where he thinks this comes from, because it doesn't fit anything if you look at terms of National Socialist policy and theory. Okay, so quoting TIK History again, in Hitler's mind, nations are created only by Aryan races, and the individuals of the Aryan race work together for the betterment of their racial community. Uh, he says that superior races mixes its blood with the inferior races, and the blood gets weak and the nation falls apart, since only pure-blooded people can create nations. If there are no Aryans left, then, by this logic, civilization itself will end. The greatness of the Aryan is not based on his intellectual powers, but on his willingness to devote all his faculties to the service of the community. The Jew offers the most striking contrast to the Aryan. There is probably no other people in the world who have so developed the instinct of self-preservation as the so-called chosen people. What the Jewish people's readiness for sacrifice does not extend beyond the simple instinct of individual preservation. Jews act only in concord with a common danger threatens them, or a common prey attracts them. Where these two motives no longer exist, then the most brutal egotism appears, and these people who before had lived together in unity will turn into a swarm of rats that bitterly fight against each other. So what we're pointing out here is that uh, the idea that the only reason, the inference is that Hitler was actually kind of okay with free markets as long as it didn't cause people of different cultures to work happily together, and that's very much nonsensical. Everything he is saying, and I'm assuming most of this is coming probably from Mein Kampf. Uh, if this is what he believed, and everything indicates that he was acting on his belief system, uh, free markets had a much greater problem than just being a conduit where people might become amiable towards each other and then harder to fight against. Uh, Very clearly, this idea of how the race comes together as one in terms of his Aryans. The race comes together as one and basically works only for the betterment of the race. That's not the free market. That's clearly some form of socialism. And when he goes on to essentially dunk on the Jews for being hyper individualistic, that pretty much sounds like dunking on the free market, because the free market is the ultimate vehicle of individualism. Uh, so again, I'm willing to believe that he may not have meant it to come across the way he did. Uh, Learning about the deep machinations of how uh, National Socialist philosophy and National Socialist economic theory work hurts the brain, and I don't invite people to do this uh, for light reading. It's torture. So he ends his article with this. So were the Nazis socialists? Only according to themselves. But then again, as far as different forms of socialism go, there's pretty much always been the case. So I see this as highly problematic in many ways, because first, he's kind of uh, saying the idea that um, people practicing socialism can be not called socialists if enough other people decide that they weren't, especially if they were socialists. Because, and he's not saying that part, I'm adding that, because the primary groups that benefit from National Socialism not being socialism are the other socialist groups, because they don't want to be guilty by association. If we routinely called the Nazis National Socialists, I think socialism itself would have a lot of problems. By burying it in its acronym, I mean, I think it gives cover to this idea that the other forms of socialism are very distinct and different from this. Uh, when in most cases, it's just a matter of determining which group is going to end up on the wrong side of a bayonet. I think really Nazis are excluded from the socialist camp because this is the one group of socialists that were so far on the losing side of history that it's damage to all other forms of socialism to allow any association of National Socialism to its surviving socialist competitors. So, what do you think? Uh, is the issue of avoiding calling National Socialism a form of socialism something that socialists are essentially making a point of trying to avoid? They don't want to be associated with them. Do you agree with that sentiment? If for some reason you think National Socialism isn't socialism, give an argument that I haven't covered here in terms of the idea, because this private property privatization capitalism thing is really is bunk. There's very little to it. Even uh, Leninist socialism on its way to communism, which it never made its way, had bouts of privatization, had bouts of creating cartelization, never got rid of their money supply, and there were implied forms of ownership that were not a whole lot different than what the National Socialists were doing. So come up with better arguments there. I'd appreciate if you smashed the like button. If you think there's somebody out there who might find this interesting, please share it with them. And if you like my content, please subscribe. I put out a handful of these every week. I have a pretty far-ranging group of interests. Well, thank you for spending time with me tonight. Hope to see you again in a future video.